So visualization, yeah, absolutely is going mainstream, and we're seeing the social impact in so many different ways, whether it's, flatten the curve, where it wasn't even a visualization of data, it was just using the form of a visualization, 2 area charts. And that caused, all of this broad scale societal change where we all decided to, stay in our homes to try and flatten the curve, right? And I think that's one of the best examples of visualizations having social change. But we also see that in hurricane forecasts, where as hurricanes are coming from the Atlantic, you see in many, news media, all these different sorts of hurricane maps trying to help people understand, whether they're going to be in any sort of danger and things like that. And you have to visualize the uncertainty associated with that hurricane forecast. And so there's lots of different ways in which visualizations end up having social impact. When people are engaging with visualization, we tend to think about, first of all, do they actually understand what the visualization is saying? Do they get that takeaway message? But also, are people, clicking on it? Are they looking at the tooltips? Are they discussing it on social media? That's particularly, again, going back to COVID, something we saw a lot of, where, these charts, particularly the Financial Times was producing, people spent all of this time talking about it on social media. They kept resharing these charts, they changed the charts, they annotated the charts. Some people even memed the charts to, highlight countries that were doing well as the countries that drank bubble tea, and the countries that weren't doing well as countries that didn't drink bubble tea. That's what we mean by engagement. What are the different ways in which people are sort of thinking about, talking about visualizations? Sure. So during COVID, and when I say science was happening in public, I think I was trying to paraphrase or quote Carl Bergstrom, who had a piece about this in the New York Times op-ed, and the rough idea is that so much of COVID was happening in real time, right? This wasn't a data set that we had collected a long time ago and continued to evaluate. That we were collecting the data, curating the data, making sense of the data, all in real time, and that was happening in public, on Twitter, and that was, I think, one of the first times just general people saw this process of data analysis of science happening. And I think what was maybe surprising to people is how much uncertainty is associated with that process. The fact that science often isn't settled, right? And that often science is a very social process. So it's people sort of agreeing about whether or not, deaths versus cases should be the metric, or even what counts as a symptom, what counts as a case. Is it symptomatic, asymptomatic, things like that. So even definitions aren't definitions that have sprung naturally from anywhere, but it's because we as a set of people, scientists, experts, communities, society has decided that this definition makes sense for us to use. And so this was the first time all of this was happening, not behind closed doors in the sense of, within a scientific conference or within papers that only other scientists read, right? Previously, it would just be scientists talking to other scientists. Now, it was still scientists talking to other scientists, but all the rest of us could watch that happening. And I think that's really where there was this potentially large disconnect between how everyday people think about how science operates and works, and maybe thinking that there's a more fundamental truth, and the way in which science often actually operates, where we are in search of a more fundamental truth, but there's a lot of stuff that happens in between. We're still sort of in the process of figuring out that sort of impact that these different sort of predictive models communicating uncertainty has on people's ability to actually make social change. So this is a very active research question, particularly folks like my good friend and colleague Lakes Padilla at the University of California, Merced, has spent a lot of time thinking about running experiments measuring that sort of impact. So from a sort of scientific perspective, I don't know that I have a really crisp, solid answer, but it's definitely something a lot of us are trying to start to better understand. There's so many. I think this idea of trust is sort of one thing that we're really focused on and worried about, because in an era where there's just mounting distrust, whether in the government, whether in policymakers, science, etc. Just using data, which might have worked for us in the past because we maybe previously liked to think of data being clean and uncontested and all of these things. In this new era, everything is on the table, right? And so really figuring out how to engender trust in people, whether that's helping people further look at the process that went into collecting the data, into analyzing the data, producing the visualization. I think figuring out this question of trust is perhaps one of the biggest.